Another huge move that happened is Paul George signing with the Philadelphia 76ers on a 4-year, $212 million contract. I thought that he was going to stay in LA. I thought that's where he wanted to be, paired up with Kawhi. He got his buddy Russ there. And from what I understand, it's just a matter of the contract length. He wanted a 4-year deal. LA was willing to offer 3, but not 4. And they just wanted to be on the same timeline as guys like James Harden and Kawhi. Kawhi has 3 more years there. James Harden just re-signed on a 2-year, $70 million deal. So I believe that the LA Clippers, they wanted Paul George to be on the same timeline and get him a 3-year deal. They got no problem with that. They can give him a 3-year max, but they don't want to do 4. And I don't understand it from a front office perspective. Why you didn't move on earlier if this was the plan? Why didn't trade him at the deadline to get some assets instead of letting him walk for nothing? Because if he wants that 4-year deal and he's adamant about that 4-year deal and you're not going to give him that, and you know you're not going to give him that, then why keep him on the roster? The LA Clippers, sure, they went on a good run. They made the playoffs as the 5 seed, but they were semi-contenders. They were never proper championship contenders. And now, especially with this team, you're not contenders at all. You've got Kawhi. Kawhi's still great, but you deal with injury issues with him. James Harden, he's regressed. He's still a solid player. Russell Westbrook has definitely regressed, but he can also be a contributing player. You've got contributors on this team. However, Paul George elevated you, having him alongside these guys. He elevated you to be a championship contender, or at least a pseudo-contender, and now you're not that. And you let him walk for nothing. You don't get any assets back. You could still be in contention if you traded him at the deadline or something like that. In the LA Clippers, this experiment has been going on since 2019, and it has not been successful whatsoever. So maybe not even at this trade deadline. Why didn't you move on from him last offseason or the offseason before? Because the LA Clippers, it's just been injury after injury, disappointment after disappointment. And that's nothing to take away from the talent of these guys like Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. But this stint is going to go down as very forgettable in 20 years down the line. I don't think many people are going to be bringing up, hey, do you remember when Paul George and Kawhi Leonard were on the same team and James Harden and Westbrook? Because this team was just disappointment year after year. And you get nothing out of it now because you let the second best player on your team walk in free agency. And that second best player made you a pseudo contender and you let him walk for nothing. And for Paul George, I get why he wants a 4-year contract. I think he'll definitely be well worth the money for at least 2, maybe 3 years. And then Philly, they kind of might regret it in the 4th year, but you can trade off of him. Guys, Paul George is always going to contribute. So you're always going to have a team. You're going to have guys that would love to play with Paul George, would love to add Paul George to their team. But for Philly, these 1 or 2 next years, they're a team to watch in the East. Boston is a juggernaut. They're going to be number 1 in the East probably, barring major injuries, major disappointment. But Philly can definitely slide in that number 2 seed, especially with a team like Milwaukee. They disappointed massively this year. The Miami Heat, they don't show up in the regular season that often. And Philly, New York is another team to keep in contention for that 2 seed. But Philly, adding Paul George, this makes you a proper contender. Joel Embiid, he had a good playoff series for what seems like first time in forever. And a lot of that, I think it had to do with injuries. I don't think he was necessarily as bad a playoff shopper as people thought. He wasn't a playoff riser, that's for sure. But I think injuries just kind of messed up that narrative. Tyrese Maxey has blossomed into an all-star. And I think any team could use Paul George, like I said. So I think he'll fit in very well with Philly, especially they just lost a guy like Tobias Harris. You say what you want about Tobias. I think he was well overpaid. And I think he's overpaid on his new contract with Detroit. But Tobias, he was a good scorer. And so Paul George can fill that scoring void and more. He can play defense as well. He can play make for others somewhat. Paul George is going to do great in Philly. It just leaves me scratching my head on what the LA Clippers were doing. But it'll be great to see Paul George in a new place next year.